Here's a quick preview of some of the things you'll see on this video. There's stereoscopic supervision and toolset development, conform tools, some measurement tools in Nuke, a compositing reel for the last few movies I worked on, a bit about my sabbatical and research project into stereo, and audience reactions that give me a fair bit of inspiration. There's an introduction to stereo theory, which is probably one of a kind, and also in the extras is a little bit about my environmental activism. There's chapter markers if you want to skip around. My career started in 1994 as a broadcast TV camera operator and editor covering motorsports. I then specialized in editing TVCs in linear tape suites and Avid, transitioning through digital linear online editor, Senior Henry, Senior Inferno. I moved to features with Shake, rising to senior compositor before becoming a VFX supervisor. Then in 2005 I commenced a 3-year sabbatical to research, shooting, posting and presenting stereoscopic imagery, which is documented elsewhere on this video. I then supervised the stereo and Legend of the Guardians at Animal Logic. It also had a 70mm 3D IMAX release. The following is part of a presentation I made for the Australian Film, Television and Radio School's Stereoscopics Masterclass. So let's start with some of the layout tools. This is one of the techniques I set up to take measurements to ascertain how far away the near subject and far distances were from the camera. We could very rapidly acquire the X and Y values as well as Z from the camera. I also gave Maya the ability to get the latest edit from the database and conform the values in a graph. So a lot of potential issues could be immediately identified and dealt with by the artist. I created a tool called Crew View, which would render an additional play blast of a viewpoint behind the shot cameras. The artist's visualization rig was left enabled so we could see exactly where they made each measurement and where the cinema screen will be perceived in relation to the set. Being quite a dynamic action film, there's a lot of shots where things were quite distant and then suddenly in your face and distant again, so that's where this tool really helped. In the foreground we have a number of graphs, the near subject, far and infinity being red, green, blue and magenta. The dip in the yellow line tells us that the focal length is animated, and that would be quite detrimental to stereo if we overlooked it. The small ticks on the black line tell us exactly where the interaxial is being keyframed, and likewise for the white line telling us that the window position has been pulled closer twice throughout this shot. The white translucent plane with the green border is the cinema screen, and with the overscan plan for this shot we have the ability to pull it as close as the white rectangle. The orange rectangle represents our near limit of -1%. The red, green and blue translucent planes are where the artist took those measurements. Generally the ideal scenario you're looking for when setting interaxial is proportional Z scale compared to X and Y set by the focal length. When I was doing my research project in rural Australia, it quickly became apparent that there were temporal considerations to be aware of when cutting between shots in stereo. It takes time for your eyes to reconverge when we cut to a new shot with a different subject disparity. While each shot in itself could be perfectly comfortable to look at, there could be a moment of discomfort immediately following a cut. And it dawned on me that we could do dynamic transitions to mitigate the strain on people's eyes across cuts, allowing us to compose each shot on creative parameters rather than physiological limitations. I wrote this software that would conform scenes in Nuke, allow me to take measurements and then do dynamic transitions across the cuts, and that's what those little white kicks are on the line across the graph. Nuke would advise me if the edit had changed for any of the scenes I'd worked on, and exactly which shots had been added, removed or shuffled, and which cuts needed to be updated. Watch this scene again without your glasses on and you'll see the slight shifting after some of the cuts, and that's the work that your eyes aren't doing due to the cut cushioning. This is what a conform scene looks like in Nuke. All the measurements you make are preserved when the edit changes, and the things like graphs and stuff were generated by hijacking rotopaint nodes, and all the on-screen displays and stuff are done there too. When the farm was quiet, scenes would render faster than real time. I like to be quite specific when investigating potential problems in stereo, and Nuke is my weapon of choice when creating tools to help with that. This is an example of some of the sort of things we can accomplish when we utilize callbacks to intercept creation of rotopaint strokes, effectively giving us API-like access to mouse events on the image, with the advantage of the coordinates being relative to the image regardless of zoom and pan. So this is a super stereo shot where we've let the disparities go quite extreme in the negative, and this diagnostic tool is going to let us take measurements and assess the roundness of the characters. We start by creating a paint stroke connecting the nearest and furthest things in the shot, being the bird's nose and the background. I've used a shortcut there to name this brush stroke depth range, which every shot we analyze will have. We're now just using the near and far sliders in a difference mat to zero in and assign those disparities to points we selected. I'll now identify what the subject of the shot is, being the blue bird, with a single tap paint stroke. I use S as a shortcut to name the stroke subject. And this is what the image will zero on when we do the initial ping pong. It tends to be more comfortable and informative than ping ponging around the window. The near slider tells us the songbird's eye is at -2.9, which is quite extreme, but acceptable for the transient nature of this shot. We want to take a closer look at this area of the image, so we switch to an erase brush and a 16:9 box will be fitted around our stroke. I find it quite informative to do a depth rack around a specific character, so I'll create a new stroke connecting the nearest and furthest points on the owl and give the item a descriptive name. You can see we've now got 3 strokes in total, and there's a lot of other information that's being incorporated into the brushstroke names. This dictates how the final sequence will be assembled, and you can shuffle the brushstroke order around just by drag and drop to reorder them. It's kind of like non-linear editing. So now we just hit a button to apply the instructions, and a couple of dozen nodes around the script have keyframes injected into them, and the clip duration is determined. Here are some of the keyframe parameters. This curve ping-pongs between the left and right views, and these curves determine the dissolve out from the original image and dissolve across to the difference. And you can see the zoom there where it zooms in and then ping pongs in on the songbird's eye. And this curve controls the depth racking. You can see I've looped it 3 times as we assess the roundness of the owl. So now we'll just hit the render button and skip ahead and have a look at the results. So we start with the original framing of the shot. No doubt your eyes are feeling a little bit uncomfortable already, and that's reflected by the flickering on the -2.9% subject disparity at the top of frame. We now rack between near and far, and even on a mono render we could pause at any point and get the exact disparity of where it's currently zeroed. The total depth of 5.7 is flashing red because it's generally considered quite high, but it works fine in the cut because it's only momentary. A quick ping pong on the bluebird confirms the renders are in good shape, and then a rack on the owl tells us it's 2.0% deep, between -1.7 and +0.3. We can see how the difference progressively ripples across its face, which confirms it's quite round and not cardboarded. And then we wind up the render with the original framing. Let's have a look at the shot in context of the cut now to see how it feels. It's pretty easy to get the stereo exactly how you want on CG films. What I've really made this tool for is to help present problems that arise when shooting live action films. So I've given it a number of other functions to compare images with and without fixes applied. Here's a shot from my favourite classic film, Dial M for Murder, released in 1954. We start with a graph showing us the depth of the shot, and the green line is where the subject is positioned. Generally we can tell where the audience is going to be looking. I really like how Robert Burks, the DOP, composed so many shots in this movie with foreground, midground and background. It works so well. I can't begin to imagine all the complexities you'd encounter when shooting stereo on film, and they've done a remarkable job on this movie. But now we've got digital tools at our disposal, we can see how we can make slight improvements to it to make it a little bit more comfortable to watch. Here we can see how well Ocular Color Matcher fixes the color asymmetry between the left and right views. Now we'll also zoom in on the lamp to see how well the Color Matcher is fixing the highlights. You can also see how well Ocular Vertical Aligner is fixing the vertical alignment of the image. And here yet another fix from the Ocular Bag of Tricks, being Focus Matcher, to sharpen up the right view. And where the keystoning is most evident in the lower right of frame, we can confirm that it's been corrected. The ocular nodes are automatically detected, as are any manual fixes I apply, so it only takes a few minutes to create each one of these renders. We finish on the full frame and toggle the fixes on and off for comparison. The Hobbit was the 5th film I worked on at Weta Digital, and for this one they hired me to set up the stereo rectification pipeline. After training a few artists how to drive it, I hopped back across to the comp department and comped these shots we're seeing here. Comping this sort of stuff is a great opportunity to create new tools in Nuke and streamline the workflow further. Following this project, I went to Flying Bark Productions in Sydney to set up the CG pipeline on Maya the Bee, where I built a camera rig that improved upon the one I developed at Animal Logic. The previous project I worked on at Weta Digital was Rise of the Planet of the Apes. It's mono, but after doing so much on the technical front in Nuke on Guardians, I wanted to get back to straight compositing and make sure my skills stay current. Shake would tend to get unproductive at about 1,000 nodes in your comp. The shot coming up here on apes, I hit about 7,000 nodes. There's a lot of CG, all the faces of the cages we see at CG this shot here, and there's a lot of like 1mm gaps between the frames. And it was requested I fix that in comp rather than send it back to CG for remodeling. So it was a lot of nodes there. Tending to skip a lot of movies and a lot of shots now. This is another one I did at Weta Digital, King Kong, averaging 114.5 hours a week over the last month of the project. Back in 2004, I supervised about 90 shots for Rising Sun Pictures on Batman Begins, all of the window replacements from inside the Batmobile. We delivered ahead of schedule and under budget with a total of 6 hours artist overtime. We shot some of the elements ourselves. I guess one of the attractions of artistic endeavours is it's not only a window letting you see stuff that you wouldn't otherwise see, but it's also a doorway into other people's minds. I think of it as like a conduit of causality. You can use lenses, lights, bits and bytes to engage with people's curiosity and show them wonders, whether it's a fantasy story or just a documentary like I'm making here. There's that quote from Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in my mind, we're kind of already living in the future. We've got so much cool technology at our disposal. All we need to do is just join the dots. So this is the first public screening at Arkaroola.
No way.
What do you reckon, Katie?
Unbelievable.
I kind of found people consistently reacted the same way as myself to this kind of imagery. A simple photo of a bug is far more mesmerizing than any mega-budget visual effects shot I've worked on in mono. And with digital, we can really hone the techniques. All these sort of evolutionary steps along the way in cinema and our media is simply to better complement our existing perceptions. This is where the real technology exists. It's already in our heads. So if we photograph with two cameras, one for our left eye and one for our right, we can recreate that sense of depth. In fact, we can enhance it. I gathered a lot of information and kept a comprehensive database while doing my research. Some of the info is presented in the slates here. The near subject and far disparity is of particular importance to physiological considerations. So everything's shot with digital SLRs, with few exceptions like this graphic and satellite imagery that I bought there and mated with the radar elevation data to give it the relief. I came from the motion picture business, but there just weren't any cameras I could shoot with that would give me the technical quality that I wanted. But feeling compelled to get some motion into the show, I used a lot of time-lapse and stop motion. The little critters wouldn't lend themselves too well for stop motion, they wouldn't sit still. So that was all shot with a single camera technique. And also with the aerial photography, a single camera was the most flexible approach to get the larger interaxial. But enough of the tech. What we're actually looking at here is the strata found within the Flinders Ranges. Those double bands of the Rawnsley quartzite, we can see them again here, contain fossils of the first multicellular life known to have lived on Earth. Spragina, we just saw one there. The show is about the geology, flora, fauna and astronomy you can experience within the Flinders Ranges in South Australia. Here we see the South Celestial Pole, little gecko, the marvellous technology on their feet. A Stimson's python about 3mm away from the lens. And this is a really important aspect of shooting macro, or in fact any 3D, is you kind of have to be close to your subject. So forget about the expensive telephoto macro lenses. The best results are achieved with wide-angle lens with an extension tube so it can focus really close. The sheer complexity of human vision is a beautiful thing. And when we treat it with the respect it deserves, people tend to find it an unforgettable experience.
Very privileged. Fantastic.
Fabulous experience.
It was beautiful.
Never ever seen it like that before.
Heaps better than Avatar.
Magnificent.
Incredible. Sensational.
You've stolen the Flinders Ranges.
Things that you can't even see with the naked eye.
A revelation.
Back again tonight.
And watch it all again. It's absolutely unreal.
Mind-blowing.
Unbelievable.
Fantastic.
Very impressive.
Best 3D footage.
Quite stunning.
Very enjoyable show.
More people should see it. Educational and inspiring.
Visually stunning.
Just beautiful.
I'm speechless.
Far superior to anything I've seen in commercial films.
There should be more of this type of thing.
It's mind-blowing. This just blows me away. It's just awesome.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
When you set the aperture of a lens wide open, you effectively take an infinite number of pinhole camera images from the area of a circle defined by the frontmost lens element. By simply casting a shadow over the lens, we can force it to take images from the extreme left and right sides of the lens only. That's a 1mm hole in a piece of plastic we hold up against the lens and we move it left to right. And on that shot we saw overexposed, it was in preparation for the light loss of the shadow on the lens. We can now see that it comes into focus. But the motion parallax is the most interesting thing. Embedded within this shallow depth of field are all of these images and more. We're only doing a horizontal sweep across the lens because our eyes are horizontally opposed. That's all we're interested in for stereo. Of course, we get zero disparity where the camera is focused. And the interaxial is the width of the lens. All of this is with a single camera without moving the camera or the subject, and we can get a stereo pair like this. To further prove DOF and stereo math are identical, let's hold this circular confusion in the background and compare it against the disparity taken from the left and right sides of the lens. With regard to terminology, I tend to prefer to reserve the word interocular for use in the biological sense and use interaxial for the distance between the cameras. You're really making life hard in writing equations or making models if you don't have clear terms for each of these different things. Ortho stereo sounds good in theory. It means life size, but in reality we don't really have ortho mono to begin with. Here we've got hypo stereo, which I prefer to call gigantification. In short, if a Lego man has an interocular of 3mm and we shoot with an interaxial of 3mm and an appropriate field of view, we effectively take our audience down to that scale. Of course, if you want to take your audience down to the size of a Lego man, you have to be very close to your subject, perhaps his arm length or less. Then lighting your subject could start getting difficult if you've got this big lens butted up against him. If we go the other way and increase the distance between the cameras, we effectively make people feel like they're a giant. Don't imagine turning people into a hammerhead shark. We're actually scaling their whole body up in proportion. Some people like to shoot with converged camera rigs. My preference is to shoot parallel with overscan and then converge in post with just an X-pan on the images. It produces much cleaner stereo. The image processing that goes on in our vision, called stereopsis, needs the images to be fairly well aligned between our left and right eyes before it can find matching patterns. And using a difference map, we can visualize what goes on as people's eyes move around from one object to another in a scene. This is a very powerful diagnostic tool because even subtle adjustments are readily visible. And accurate measurements can even be obtained on parts of the image that are quite soft. Accommodation is a biological term equivalent to focus. When you sit in a cinema, your field of view is artificially restrained by the characteristics of the camera and projection system. But you could imagine this as a window in front of the camera, like a black wall with a rectangle cut out in it. But it could either be close and small or further away and larger. Technically, it'd be closer than the nearest thing touching the edge of frame because it's occluding the rest of it that you can't see. The point being, the actual position of the window is quite a nebulous concept in mono. But in stereo, the audience can triangulate the position of the window. Here we can see why some people find shooting parallel objectionable. There's the wastage on the edge of frame there. But if the cameras are converged, there's no single cinema screen that could be represented on the set. Furthermore, the keystoning on the images causes vertical misalignment. If we shoot parallel, everything is aligned. All we need to do is a horizontal pan. And provided we've got the necessary overscan, we can position the stereo window, the cinema screen, wherever we want. An alternative to panning the images is to simply offset the film backs inside the cameras, and then you can see the red area, the wastage, being eliminated, while maintaining perfect vertical alignment of the images and a single representation of the cinema screen. So the yellow area here is the stereo frustum. That's where both cameras can see. But there's these wedge areas where only one camera can see. These have the ability to cause an inverse half occlusion, which are very unnatural, more commonly known as a window violation. We'll come back to that later, but let's first have a look at what happens if we make our cameras also act as projectors. We'll move our red ball off into the distance, make our cinema screen a little bit more opaque, and then have a look at the projection of the left and right images. Here we have positive disparity when the ball is beyond the screen, now zero disparity and now negative disparity, where the right image is on the left and left on the right. And as we come forward, it pops out of the stereo frustum, and that's the point where the projections go off the left and right sides of frame. If the ball now stays in front of the window and moves across to the right, out of the left camera's field of view, we see the projection goes off the screen, and this is when a window violation occurs. We can see one on the right here. It's a little bit uncomfortable. We can correct it to an extent by floating the window. And here's the CG representation of what happens when we float the window. We simply crop one of the images off on that side of the frame. Floating windows can start to get annoying at around 1% even. So I tend to use lesser values and often find it's good to do a compromise where you don't crop out the whole thing. Generally, the preferable solution is to simply bring the window closer rather than floating the window. Let's come back to the difference mat and see how it can be used to take measurements. How it works is we take a negative and then do a 50-50 mix. It'll cancel out. If we do an X-pan, we start getting this embossed effect. So this is what happens when we apply it to a single image. Now if we introduce the second image in the stereo pair, we can see that we get the cancellation where the image is aligned. But as we do the X-pan, this plane of cancellation ripples across the terrain. So let's pull it a little bit closer than the nearest peak on this ridge and switch to a stereo view, and we can see our window is indeed positioned a little bit closer than that ridge. Now let's push the zero plane back a little bit further beyond that ridge line down the left hand side of frame. And now when we have a look in stereo, we'll see there's a window violation down the left hand side of frame. We pop back to pulling the window closer. You can see that's an example where it would have been kinder on your eyes to animate that pull back rather than just a cut. But now we've decided where we're going to position the window, we can take readings of where the near, subject and far are. And experience tells us straight away a subject at 4% is going to start straining people's eyes on a big screen. Let's have a look now and see what happens when someone changes their viewing distance from the screen. Here we've borrowed somebody's eyeballs. They sit closer to the screen. We can see the blue ball is their perceived position of the red ball. And it's actually compressed everything on the Z-axis. Whereas if they go to the back of the cinema, the blue ball is now beyond the red ball. Whether it's in positive or negative disparity, it's extruded everything on the Z-axis. Sway your head side to side while viewing these images, and you can see how the frustum defined between your eyes and the corners of the cinema screen is creating a shearing transform based on depth. There's a lot of visual phenomena that just can't be accurately represented in mono. Here the stereo cues, which are comprised mostly of just parallax, breathes wonderful life into this sulfur mine in the Greek island of Milos. And in mono we wouldn't be able to tell the position of the male statue's hand here in this war memorial. In mono this is pretty much a throwaway image for lack of separation between the kangaroo and background, but stereo makes a huge difference. A lot of that is because of the reflection on the water. Here we've got translucency now and asymmetric specular highlights, and the reflections on this car just don't fly in mono. And the same thing with the wet sand here in this fisheye lens shot. If kept to a reasonable amount, subtle asymmetry and lens flare can be great too. The asymmetry and the glitter on this salt flat is quite nice. I wish I shot it in time-lapse. Just another shot I kind of like in stereo. Flames would be great. Not shot particularly well this one. I'd like to get closer, but heat was a problem. And splashing water is great. You see all these beautiful forms. It'd be phenomenal in slow motion. It's such a simple shot, but I find it just so mesmerizing. And here the point source light puts some great sparkles on the petals of the flower. Some people claim you can't shoot shallow depth of field in stereo, but in my experience you just have to follow the same rules from mono. Focus alone isn't going to steer people's eyes around the image. You need to have a strong subject and, if necessary, appropriate lighting. I think there's sometimes this unfounded expectation that stereo images should be holograms. And creative use of depth of field is an essential tool in minimizing the workload on people's eyes. This one's deliberately here to mess with your head. And lens flares, if you're lucky you can get them right and they can sit nicely in your shot. But generally you want to avoid shooting them and put them in post if you want them a lot. All sorts of problems can arise with them. Often they're asymmetric, looking totally different between left and right eyes. And here we've got one embedded in the wall in the lower center frame there. Cardboarding results in unsatisfying 3D. Here we've got an example of it on this crystal. We can explain what's going on by looking at this cube. The far side of the cube has a 40% smaller angular size than the near side. But when we move it away and use our expensive telephoto zoom lens to enlarge it, we can see that It's only like a couple of % smaller now. It's flattened out. Doesn't matter what we do with the cameras or what we do with the interaxial, it's flattened out. We'll bring it closer to the camera and zoom out now to do like a 3D Hitchcock zoom just for fun. Another way to visualize what's going on here is to lay out some railroad sleepers with these pencils and plot on a graph the angular size of each pencil. You can see how it flattens out quite rapidly. You generally want to have your subject on the steep part of that curve. To wind up, let's have a look at this shot. We've got sufficient resolution to crop in on it. We can read some depth in it, but it's not particularly satisfying. Both in my show and in real life, I spend a lot of time in the Arkaroola Wilderness Sanctuary at the northern end of the Flinders Ranges. Even on a global stage, it's an incredibly unique geological wonder. But some clown in the South Australian government went and approved a mining exploration permit, and the prospect of a hard rock uranium mine right in the middle of the sanctuary became a very real concern. So when a company called Australian Ethical Investment and Superannuation decided to fund a mini documentary competition about corporate ethics and the environment, I decided to leap into action. And they were very generous in awarding me an $8,000 prize. But more significantly, the actions of the many thousands of people who wanted to protect Arkaroola prompted the South Australian government to do what it had to do. The mining company's been given the boot, and Arkaroola has been protected for future generations to enjoy. So here's my 2-minute mini documentary. It's in mono.
Money's the one.
I was a child when I came to know Sir Douglas Mawson just a little bit.
Dad had the most fond memories of Sir Douglas Mawson. He appreciated that this was truly a unique geological feature of Australia.
Mawson loved Arkaroola. Sir Douglas said, if you can ever do anything to protect Arkaroola for posterity, then do it.
Dad made it a bit of a challenge to try and get the government to take it up as a national park, and eventually someone in government circles said, if you feel so strongly about it, do it yourself, and that's basically what happened.
You can feel it on your feet on Mount G.
The whole mountain is, in a sense, a solid quartz crystal. It's very, very special.
And I don't think mining sees the long-term big picture.
Been looked after for tens of thousands of years.
This is their home. This is our home.
And we got to pass it on to our future generation.
It's kind of like allowing our country to be exploited or raped even.
This state is really at the forefront of exploration, and we don't have to go and mine the jewels.
That's where they buried 22,800 bags of radioactive waste. They blatantly disregarded their environmental requirements.
It was a crystal form of fluorite that was virtually unknown. Whoever looted that has taken away from us the ability to actually learn more about growing those crystals, probably a billion years ago.
I'd be pretty disappointed with a company that didn't bother to tell me that they were in an area of Class A environmental zone and what that means, and also not to tell them that it's a particularly mountainous country, which makes it inordinately more difficult to mine. With seeking a balance, it just throws out all the safeguards as far as we're concerned.
Went out there to try and protect the land, but there's a lot against me.
I think it's all about now and getting rich.
You know, if I got 10 million or something, I suppose I'd be the same, maybe. But I doubt it whether I would.